Hello and welcome back to another episode of ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia McLeod, and today I'm joined by three members of ACRO's Risk-Based Quality Management Working Group to talk through their 2023 RBQM Landscape Survey results. Danilo Branco is the Director of Central Monitoring Operations RBQM at Fortrea, Cris McDavid is the Director of Global Clinical Operations RBQM at Parexel, and Valarie McGee is Senior Director of Clinical Systems Optimization at the PPD Clinical Research Business of Thermo Scientific. Danilo, Cris, and Valarie sit down to walk me through the 2023 RBQM Landscape Survey, the fifth iteration of this project, and highlight some of the trends, opportunities, and challenges they see in the space. Enjoy! So Danilo, Valarie, Cris, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. I am very excited to have you all here. I think this is a really fun project that ACRO has been working on for over 5 years now. As I said, 5 years ago, you guys sort of set out on this mission to see how RBQM, risk-based quality management components, were being used in the clinical trial industry. Were risk assessments being used on every study? Were CROs and sponsors taking advantage of remote monitoring in clinical trials? These are some of the questions you guys, I think the larger industry and the FDA wanted the answers to, and we're here today to talk about some of those answers. For folks listening only on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen, we're going to be pulling up some slides, and you can access those on the ACRO website at any time. We'll have the link in the show notes. And we will do our best to kind of talk through them for those of you who are in listen-only mode. But if you want to check out the video version of this, that will be on the ACRO YouTube channel. Shameless plug for the YouTube. But let's just kind of dive right in. Danilo, maybe I'll start with you. As we said, 5 years, over 5 years now, but this really was our fifth year of the landscape survey. Can you tell me a little bit more about the project, what the objectives are, kind of like how we got here, what this is all about?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sophia. Well, first of all, it's really something that we are excited about it, right? 5 years of this analysis is really impressive. I'm passionate about what we are producing and the benefits that this is bringing to the RBQM methodology adoption in our industry. So a little bit about the origin of all of these, right? It goes back to 2019 when we were in discussions with FDA about how we could leverage adoption of the methodology of each of the components in our industry. And we just thought that, hey, we would need a baseline. We would need to start from somewhere in order to be able to see the trends and how this is evolving along the years. And then we performed our first survey in that year. So we have been doing, as you properly mentioned, for the last 5 years, it's around 6 to 7 CROs each year. Approximately 5,000 clinical trials, so it's quite a lot, right? It's a good pool of clinical studies, a good sample for us to really have some meaningful results. And what we are doing is to measure really the adoption of each of individual components of the larger RBQM framework. We are talking about 8 different components. So the initial and the ongoing risk assessments, KTLs, these 3 form what we call the quality by design phase. Then as we go to the monitoring phase, we have the KRIs, the centralized monitoring, the offsite and remote monitoring, the reduced SDR and reduced SDV. All of these components are being measured individually over our analysis. One of the beautiful things considering the 5 years analysis is that we are able to measure the trends, right? How we are progressing or how we are not making the progress that we would like to year after year. And this is giving us really powerful insights on how we can or where we need to put more efforts on. And to finish my initial portion here, Sophia, you asked about the main objective or what are the objectives here, and it's definitively what originated these. Remember when I said that the FDA and ACRO were thinking about how we could leverage the adoption, and that's the objective of this work stream and this survey. It's to promote adoption of the risk-based quality management components in clinical research.
That's awesome. I mean, you guys have done so much work over the past 5 years. You've collected so much data, as you know, for those looking at the video version of this have seen, but I mean, you're anywhere between 4,500 to 6,500 studies in each go round of this, survey project. So maybe Valarie, I'll ask you next, when we think about all of this data that you guys have collected over the years, and if we look at this year specifically, what was the most maybe surprising finding that you saw in the survey?
Yeah, I think there's several components that stood out or kind of hit my radar as unexpected or surprising when we take a look at that data. And just maybe putting that slide back up on the screen would be great. I think the first one kind of going across is being that relatively low rates of QTLs and KRIs, quality tolerance limits, showing just 25% of the studies in our data set, and key risk indicators only 52%. So I think there's a lot of challenges to implementing these, or reasons that sponsors may not be adopting QTLs and KRIs. A lot of times QTLs can be seen as kind of a go or no go built-in point, very similar to a stopping criteria. So you might see, for example, in a phase 1 study, if there's liver toxicity and 2 patients and the study stops, and QTLs are being seen as kind of this black and white as a threshold. And I think one thing that we'll see come about in ICH E6R3 that I hope will help with understanding and adoption is that change of language from QTLs to acceptable ranges. So hopefully that will help encourage more sponsors to adopt that concept by seeing it as a range and not a black and white stopping point. Another area is offsite or remote monitoring being used. You're seeing 56% of the studies here. We saw a huge jump in the use of that component. You can see that in this slide as well, during or right after COVID. And then we can see now a small backsliding, kind of a normalizing of that focus. But this year, we're starting again to see a trend upwards, and hopefully we can maintain that momentum moving forward. And the last one there on the screen, and the last one that I'll point out, but certainly not least, is this area is of particular interest to me, and actually may be one of the biggest hurdles in the industry. Still very frustrating to see how low the percentages are for reduced SDV. It's surprising that it's still such a struggle to get the industry and sponsors to want to make that shift, especially in large scale studies where it could be really a major benefit to their time, their costs, and allow that to be focused on really more quality driven areas of work. We know that SDV drives less than 2% of data changes, which provides little to no true real quality data quality value. So if we can continue to influence and drive those to lower percentages, it just allows for better oversight of tasks like patient safety, consenting, site protocol adherence, those processes where we can make a big difference, in areas where early detection and risk mitigation really play a larger role in quality and trial adherence. Those are the 3 major ones that really jumped out at me and can really be seen very clearly in the data here.
Yeah, Chris, Danilo, I don't know if you guys had anything, that really pinged for you in this most recent data set, but obviously please jump in if so.
It's an interesting combination, right? Because it's really one of the things we're looking at as a group and as our individual organizations as well, is the relationship between the elements, right? So while we see some that are sort of year over year, they're fairly high around your risk assessments, et cetera. But then you do see where there is not either the same growth trend or adoption trend around QTLs and key risk indicators. Yet these are things that you would expect to organically be pulling directly out of your risk assessments and then tracking and managing as part of your ongoing risk management activities. So it's a little bit interesting to see the difference in the percentages if you're looking at 87, 88% at initial or preliminary risk assessments and ongoing risk management, but then you see this dip down to 25% for QTLs and just over 50% for key risk indicators. In some cases, I think there may be a little missed opportunity there because you're really able to more effectively control for risk if you've identified what those risks are in fact for your particular protocol. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more here in a moment around centralized monitoring and these other following elements or components. But I certainly agree with Valarie in that we're still seeing folks lean heavily on traditional SDV sort of activities. And is that is that more of a comfort behavior rather than a strategic behavior, and exploring ways that we can better support our industry and moving away from some of that activity.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Chris. And I think what's interesting too, if you look at this slide, we're looking at ongoing studies, right? So you could say, oh, well, those were started before. But if you have the slide up for the new studies started in 2023, you see the same numbers, right? They're not better than they were for the ones that were started in previous years. So it's not an example of, well, if they're new, then we're starting at a better percentage. These new studies are a higher percentage are using these things. They're not. We're not seeing that.
Right. Yeah. In fact, the trending levels look very, very similar. Right. Just a small difference there. Yeah.
I absolutely echo my colleagues here. I think that we adopted, or we are trying to adopt the methodology because there is a shift. There is an important industry evolution, science evolution that we are trying to manage. The studies are getting more and more complex, and the RBQM methodology is here to bring more quality while promote efficiencies as well, enable efficiencies to the clinical trial conduct. The number of data sets that we are collecting nowadays is huge, so we need to change a little bit our mindset from this SDV approach, and there is a huge space here for improvement. I think that we are doing a good job in these initial risk assessments we are identifying, but there is room for improvements in terms of how we utilize that along the way during the life cycle of the study.
Yeah, and I mean, you guys have sort of, begun to allude to some of these challenges, opportunities. Maybe Chris, I'll ask you to start and kind of kick us off if we think about, where do we really see these challenges and opportunities lying, whether we're thinking about centralized monitoring or reduced SDR, STV, what do you see as kind of the next phase of this? Where do we go to address the challenges and also, some of the good opportunities?
Right. I really do believe that it goes back to the relationship between the elements. And even if we were to look at our survey results again, you see, I'll go back to that initial risk assessment, that ongoing risk management, the key risk indicators, the quality tolerance limits. Those 4 elements are very closely related, and they organically lead towards your other 4 elements. So if we just think for a moment about centralized monitoring, source data verification, source data review, centralized monitoring, the aggregate analysis of data, is really what should be the foundation that you're able to build out your risk-based monitoring strategy and allow for that reduced SDV and that reduced SDR. And I understand that different organizations and different protocol teams even have sort of a different stance on some of these things. For some folks, they may say, well, centralized monitoring technology is very costly. And in some cases it may be. But let's think about that sort of compared or put up against the cost of not catching an emergent safety risk or lack of usable efficacy data until well into your project lifecycle. And now you are either trying to play catch up or clean up, or, worst case scenario, a critical event has occurred that could have been prevented through the aggregate analysis of data. Then when you think, about protocol or project size, we have some folks that'll say, well, if it's just a small number of patients, we don't need to do centralized monitoring. But it's not just about the patient count. It's also about the volume of the data and the type of data. Danilo made reference to all these different sources of e-data and different types of e-data. And if you're not reviewing or interrogating, analyzing this data in an aggregate in a centralized fashion, how are you doing? What number of hours is it going to take to scrub this data, and how manual is that process? We know there's a better way to do it, right? And that's through the central monitoring mechanism. And if you were doing that consistently and driving that heavily out of your risk assessment activities and the identification of your critical data and your key risk, then you are able to implement risk-based monitoring strategies that are reduced SDV, reduced SDR. There's not an automatic assumption, or there should not be an automatic assumption that you're going to save a huge amount of money and it's just going to half your cost. That's not the way you should think about it. The way you should think about it, though, is there is an offset. And if you have a project that's several hundred patients, maybe even thousands of patients, what is the time and the effort going to be required to do 100% SDV or 100% SDR on that amount of data? It's significant, in some cases, really significant. And how much time are your monitors now standing in clinic on site? If you're able to pull back from some of that because you have confidence in your centralized monitoring activities, then you're able to pull back off the site a bit. You're able to reduce your travel time costs, those sorts of elements. Another thing to think about is the offsite remote monitoring. You're able to do more of that offsite, more of that remotely. That's the fourth element right there with your centralized monitoring, your reduced SDV, your reduced SDR. And quite frankly, the whole idea of doing centralized monitoring, but continuing to hold on to that 100% SDV, 100% SDR, it's a little bit about like the suspenders and belt approach, right? It's so instead of taking that approach and doubling down, really put some thought and consideration into how you stand up your centralized monitoring so you're confident in what the data is telling you, and then let the data drive your monitoring. That's really how I think about it, just the interplay of those elements.
Yeah, just get a good belt, invest in a quality belt.
Right.
That's a good way to think about it. Danilo, Valarie, do you guys have any other thoughts, here about what you guys see as sort of the opportunities going forward?
No, I think, Chris, you said it really well, in that it all has to play together. I mean, we see a lot of companies maybe understanding that they need centralized monitoring, and they're starting to do that, or they may be managing that part themselves, but then they're also still driving those high monitoring percentages. They're not making adjustments based on the elements that they're adopting. Right. So it's like you said, it's got to be a play together scenario where you see how increasing in one area allows you to decrease in those others, and not just from 100%, right? Even 50% of your SDR, SDV, you're still, that's just all the time that the monitors focus on. They get so focused on just those pieces. We don't see that quality of site oversight and management that we should be seeing. So how can we really balance those elements together?
Right. I agree. And I wholeheartedly agree that quite often such emphasis is put on those SDV, SDR activities that what's not being asked is what's not being done, or what areas not getting the appropriate amount of attention, or how could the site relationship be better if that monitor were able to spend, real interactive time with the site and having a dialogue rather than simply working through a checklist, which is heavily weighted by these sort of transcription checking activities, right? And I'll be fair, I do understand that people say, well, but you've got to prove that it works. And I won't 100% say I disagree with that, but it is a little bit like trying to prove a negative, right? So I do think it's interesting. We're 5 years into the survey and we're seeing some consistency in some areas of adoption, but we're still seeing sort of that holding back or that hesitancy. And for some individuals that may be sort of in that more hesitant sort of camp or arena, and they're looking for proof, maybe the proof is in what hasn't happened, what you haven't had to go fight a fire on, or not having to reopen enrollment or add sites or whatever the case may be, because your data is coming in as expected. And if there is an issue or an emergent risk that's identified in the data, it's early enough that your teams are able to course correct and work with sites to course correct so that you can continue on your scheduled timelines as planned.
That make me think about one definition of quality that I heard in the past, as quality is the absence of errors that matters, right? I'm not saying that this is the best definition, but it's a nice one. And if we think about that and we merge this definition with some studies published already, or some other very recent studies presented in one recent industry forum, where the presenters or the authors are indicating that more than 97% of the total data set for a clinical trial never changes after the initial entry in the data capture platform. I mean, that means that just less than 3% change, and from these 3%, just a small piece is based on STV findings. So why we keep investing so hard and so heavy in an activity that is not really adding that high amount of value, and we are losing the chance, as Cris and Valarie mentioned, to invest this time on site in supporting site staff, in building up a relationship, in understanding their challenge, rather than just being transcription check oriented. So all of these aspects really matters when we consider the adoption of the methodology and the power that it has if properly implemented.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you guys have sort of outlined here, there is talk of challenges. I think sometimes, like we said, people are hesitant. Change is an interesting topic in our industry. But I think, the opportunities really kind of overshine the challenges, and it'll be interesting to see, where we continue to go with data like this and the learnings from, these type of collection efforts that you guys have, as I've said many times, run over the past 5 whole years. And so thinking a little more future looking, I'd love to hear from all of you, but maybe Danilo, I'll start with you first. As we think about running this survey again next year, which I hope we'll do, I'd love to know kind of what you guys are hoping to see from future gatherings of this data, and maybe, what else we might be able to learn.
That's a nice one, Sophie. I think that we kind of touched on this question already, or some insights on the response, but one in particular that I'm looking for is the combo of central monitoring with reduced SDV and SDR. My colleagues and I, we have talked today about these, right? And it's pivotal, right? We are dealing with a very high cost development of new compounds, and we need to find ways to be more efficient, while we are also focusing on, or more importantly, focusing on the quality enhancement, and really impacting the quality of data in order to help us to have more informed decisions. And when we put that in mind, centralized monitoring is providing or wider oversight in almost near real time. We have fantastic technology solutions nowadays to help us to build dashboards and analytics in order to help us to really take informed decisions. So from the data oversight perspective, centralized monitoring is the strongest technique that we can have. And what is the other side, right? Where we can find efficiencies is really reducing the SDV, especially the SDV and the SDR, and making sure that we will have our CRAs at site and performing activities that will really add value, instead of just overlapping or doing a lot of transcription check things.
Yeah, and I think as we move forward in the industry, right, we need to see ourselves as drivers and supporters of adoption for these components. We are responsive to our sponsors' needs and what their preferences are, yes, but we also have to be able to provide a really strategic risk-based plan for them. Right, and help them to understand how it all plays together, as Cris said earlier. Right, that if we can't demonstrate that to them, they can't understand it or feel confident that it's going to work. So it's also about us being able to expand on that and demonstrate that to them, explain those things, and not just to our sponsors, but also inside of our own organizations. Right, we've got to have not just our leadership that understands it, but also those working on these studies every day. They need to feel confident that the actions and the tasks that they're doing on a daily basis to keep these projects running and going are the best tasks that they could be doing. that it's not something that they just have to check off a list, that they really see the importance and the value of what they're doing to support these and inside of these things, right? So if they realize that the SDV isn't the important, having that conversation with the site about their consenting process or how they're assigning IP is really what's going to drive at this site, the quality at this particular site in an area where they may be having struggles, rather than doing that checkbox data matching. If they understand their contributions to that quality, I think that can really play a big part moving into the future too.
I completely agree with Valarie and Danilo in both of their comments. I do think there is an associated factor that we are going to see drive these different RBQM elements, I think, upward in adoption, which is the decentralization of data. We're going to continue to see less data captured in EDC systems. So what will be really interesting is the difference in the types of risk identified around that and around the increased work with ECOA data or decentralized data, how we manage that as an industry going forward. It's not that it's new. We didn't just invent ECOA. It's that it's increasing significantly in making up the critical data for a protocol and what we are actually collecting for analysis, whether that's for safety analysis or efficacy analysis, whatever it may be, right? Ultimately for submissions. How we identify the risk around that, how we control for those risks. So what sort of key risk indicators will we see in the future? Are acceptable ranges, acceptable thresholds around quality tolerance? And from a data interrogation or monitoring sort of perspective, you're organically going to see more of that move into centralization out of medical clinics, so offsite activities or virtual activities, including SDR, because the data is not going to be in the clinic. It's going to be associated with the clinic, but the patient data is not necessarily going to be in the clinic. So because of that, I would expect that we'll see a difference in what, say, the first four elements content looks like. So what that initial risk assessment, what that ongoing risk management, what those key risk indicators and QTLs, what they look like. And what I would expect to see in the other four elements around the centralized monitoring and offsite monitoring, SDV and SDR, reduced SDV, reduced SDR, is I would expect to see them organically going up. So an increasing in adoption as we adapt with the world, right? We all get very, very excited about technology and we all love the shiny new thing. But, Aston Martin in the driveway is only good if you know how to drive. Right. So as we get better at using technology and collecting and assessing our data through these different means, I think that we'll see the increased adoption as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to look forward to here. I mean, you guys have done a really great amount of work this year, over the past few years. I think I've said that a million times today. But I'm really hopeful that, I can have the three of you back on the podcast in a year's time and we can talk about the 2024 data and kind of what that illuminates for us. But that really kind of covers all the topics I wanted to touch on with you guys today. This has been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone listening / watching has. And like I said, for anyone listening on the audio version of this, slides are available on the ACRO website at all times. The link will be below. This has been so much fun. Thank you guys for joining me today. And I will see you next year. I'm going to just put that into the universe. We'll be back. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of GCP. Again, you can find all of the data that was discussed today linked in the show notes. Be sure to join me for our next episode focused on the state of clinical trials in the UK.